The blast came before the sound of it, a wall of heat that lifted the lead vehicle off the road and dropped it back down on its side like a toy knocked off a shelf. Dust rolled across the convoy in a thick brown wave, and for 3 full seconds nobody moved at all. Then the screaming started. First Lieutenant Bree Calloway was 40 yards back in the second vehicle, restocking a trauma bag on her knees when the shockwave hit. Her ears rang with a high, flat whine that swallowed every other sound. She didn't remember opening the door. She remembered running. The lead vehicle was a twisted shell of metal, smoke pouring from the engine block, one wheel still spinning uselessly in the air. 2 soldiers were already crawling free, coughing, bleeding from small cuts, walking wounded. A third man lay motionless near the back tire, and Bree's eyes found him and stayed there even as her legs carried her forward. Inside the vehicle, pinned against a buckled door panel, was General Daniel Ashworth, 4 stars on his collar, blood soaking through his uniform at the abdomen, his face gray with shock. He was conscious. He was furious. Men like him stayed furious as a way of staying alive. "Get me a surgeon," he said, the words coming out thin and strained. "Get me a real surgeon." Bree didn't answer him. She was already cutting away his uniform with trauma shears, her hands moving faster than her thoughts, counting the things that mattered: pulse, breathing, the dark spreading stain at his side that told her everything she needed to know about how little time they had. "Pulse is 140, she called out to nobody and everybody. "He's losing blood fast. I need pressure here, now." A young specialist named Ivy Sanderson dropped beside her, hands already reaching for gauze. Behind them, Sergeant Walter Combs was pulling the second wounded soldier away from the wreck, shouting for a stretcher. The driver, a quiet corporal named Sam Doyle, had not moved since the blast, and one look told Bree there was nothing left to do for him. She filed that grief away the way she had learned to file it away, in a drawer she would open later, alone, when it was safe to. "Calloway, I've got arterial bleeding over here," Combs called, voice tight with strain. The second soldier, a young corporal whose leg had been torn open by flying debris, was losing blood fast, his face already going pale. Bree's eyes flicked between the 2 casualties for half a second, doing the same brutal arithmetic every combat medic learns to do without wanting to. The general was bleeding internally, hidden and slow. The corporal was bleeding externally, fast and visible, the kind of wound that could take a life in minutes if nobody acted. "Ivy, hold pressure here. Don't let up no matter what," Bree said, guiding the younger nurse's hands into position over the general's wound. She crossed to the corporal in 3 quick strides, wrapped a tourniquet above the wound with practice speed, cinched it tight enough to make him cry out, and was back at the general's side within 20 seconds, her hands finding their place again as if she had never left. "Direct pressure. Elevate it. Get him on the next stretcher," she told Combs, already turning her full attention back to Ashworth. There was no time to dwell on the decision she had just made. No time to wonder whether it had been the right one. There was only the next 30 seconds and the 30 after that. Right now there was only the general, and the general was dying. "Where is Major Lowry?" Bree shouted, naming the base surgeon, the only fully qualified surgeon assigned to Forward Operating Base Cobalt Ridge. The answer came back over the radio in pieces, broken by static. Major Edward Lowry was 40 minutes out on a separate medevac run, escorting 2 casualties from a different incident, and there was no way to turn that flight around in time. 40 minutes. The general had perhaps half that, if the bleeding inside him was what Bree suspected it was. Then who operates on him? The voice belonged to Colonel Harold Briggs, the base commander, who had run from the command tent the moment the blast registered on the perimeter sensors. He was staring down at the man pinned in the wreckage, doing the same arithmetic Bree had already finished. There was no surgeon, there was no time, there was a body bleeding out in front of them, and a base full of people who were not supposed to be able to save it. "We get him stable and we get him on the table the second Lowry lands," Briggs said, more to himself than to anyone else. Bree pressed both hands hard against the wound, feeling the warm, slick blood push between her fingers no matter how much weight she put behind them. The general's eyes found hers through the haze of pain, and there was something in them that was not gratitude. It was suspicion. It was the look of a man who had spent 30 years deciding who was qualified to touch him and who was not. And right now, the only hands on his body belonged to a 26-year-old nurse he had never met. "Where is the surgeon?" he said again, quieter this time, as if saying it softer might make it more true. "On the way, sir," Bree said, Hold still. They loaded him onto a stretcher and carried him at a near run toward the aid station, boots pounding the dirt road, dust kicking up behind them. Bree stayed at his side the entire way, one hand still pressed against the wound, the other steadying his shoulder against the jolting motion of the stretcher. She could feel his pulse weakening under her palm, feel it the way a person feels a clock losing time. Inside the aid station, the world narrowed to fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of a monitor finding his heartbeat. Captain Nora Whitfield, the senior nurse on base and the closest thing Bree had to a mentor, was already pulling equipment from cabinets before the stretcher had fully stopped moving. "Talk to me," Nora said. "Penetrating abdominal trauma, heavy internal bleeding, pressure dropping," Bree said. "He needs surgery now, not in 40 minutes. Nora's eyes flicked to her. Just for a second, something passing between them that neither of them said out loud. They both knew what Bree had done once before, in a place far from here, when there had been no surgeon for 6 days, and men had been dying anyway. They both knew it was not supposed to happen again. They both knew that right now, it might have to. "Lowry's not landing in time," Nora said. "You know that." "I know that," Bree said. The monitor beside the general let out a thin, sharp tone, the kind of sound that meant his blood pressure had dropped below the line where things stopped being recoverable. Bree's hands were already moving, already reaching for the tray of instruments that nobody had asked her to reach for, already doing the math on how many minutes the general had left against how many minutes it would take to do this properly, carefully, correctly. Ashworth's eyes were still open, fixed on her, fading at the edges the way eyes do when the body starts deciding what to keep awake and what to let go. "You are not a surgeon," he managed. "No, sir," Bree said. "I'm what's here." Colonel Briggs stood in the doorway of the aid station, radio in one hand, watching a decision form in front of him that he had never trained for and never wanted to make. Behind him, Major Gerald Pratt, the operations officer, had arrived in time to hear the last exchange, and his face had gone hard with a different kind of alarm, the kind that lives in regulations and liability, and the careful order of who is permitted to do what. "Calloway, step back," Pratt said. "We wait for Lowry." "He doesn't have 40 minutes, Bree said, not looking up from the monitor. "That is not your call to make." "Then whose is it?" Bree said, and for the first time that day, her voice did not shake at all. The room went quiet except for the monitor, ticking down with the general's pulse, counting a number that was getting smaller every time it appeared. Nora Whitfield stood at Bree's shoulder, gloved hands hovering over a second tray, waiting to see which way this would break. Ivy Sanderson stood frozen near the supply cabinet, eyes moving between the dying general and the young lieutenant who had once, in a place none of them were supposed to talk about, done exactly this, and saved 3 lives doing it. Major Pratt was not finished. If she opens him up and he dies on that table, this base answers for it. She answers for it. Are you prepared for that, Colonel? Are you prepared to explain why we let him die waiting for paperwork to catch up? Briggs said, not turning around. Pratt's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. There was nothing left in the regulations that covered this exact hour, this exact wound, this exact absence of any other option. Rules were built for situations where there was time to follow them. This was not one of those situations. Bree heard none of it clearly. The argument behind her had become background noise, the same way the ringing in her ears after the blast had faded into something she no longer noticed. All that mattered was the man in front of her, the wound under her hands, and the 6 days she had spent once before learning exactly what her hands were capable of when nobody else was coming. She remembered the heat of that outpost, the smell of dust and diesel, the first time she had picked up a scalpel because the alternative was watching a soldier bleed to death on a folding table while everyone around her waited for permission that would never arrive in time. She remembered how her hands had not shaken then either, not because she was fearless, but because fear was a luxury reserved for people who had somewhere else to be. She did not have somewhere else to be. She had a table, a wound, and a clock that was no longer being kind to anyone in the room. Colonel Briggs looked at the monitor. He looked at Pratt. He looked, finally, at Bree, standing over the most powerful man on this base with blood on her hands and a steadiness in her face that did not belong to someone 26 years old. "Lieutenant," he said slowly, "are you telling me you can do this?" Bree did not answer right away. She thought of 6 days in a forgotten outpost with no surgeon, and 3 men who would have died without her. She thought of one man that same week, who had not made it, and how she still heard his voice some nights when the base went quiet. She thought of everything that could go wrong in the next 20 minutes, every way this could end her career, her freedom, the general's life. Then she looked down at Daniel Ashworth, 4 stars and fading fast, and she answered the only way that mattered. "Get me a second pair of hands," she said, "and get out of my light." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Nora Whitfield reached for a tray of instruments and set it down within Bree's reach, and Colonel Briggs stepped back from the doorway instead of forward into it, and somewhere outside the thin canvas walls of the aid station, the general's life had quietly become the responsibility of the one person in the building everyone had been trained to overlook. The monitor ticked again. The number had not improved. Bree picked up the scalpel. The first cut was the hardest, not because of skill, but because of everything riding behind it. Bree felt the resistance of skin and tissue under the blade, felt the room hold its breath around her, and made herself think only of the next motion, then the one after that, refusing to let her mind wander to the rank of the man on the table, or the rank of the men watching her. "Suction," she said, and Nora Whitfield had it in her hand before the word finished leaving her mouth. Blood pooled faster than expected, dark and warm, filling the cavity as fast as Nora cleared it. Bree's eyes moved across the wound, searching for the source the way she had been taught to search, methodically, ignoring the noise of the monitor behind her, ignoring the sound of Major Pratt pacing somewhere near the doorway, ignoring everything except the geography of torn tissue in front of her. There, a vessel, nicked by shrapnel, leaking steadily into the cavity. Not the worst injury she had seen, not the easiest either. "Clamp," she said. Nora placed it in her palm without being asked twice. Bree worked the instrument into position, feeling for the give of tissue under metal, feeling for the moment when pressure would finally hold instead of slip. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was not. Not entirely, but breathing did not need to be steady to get the job done. Only hands did. Behind her, the general's monitor let out a small, encouraging change in tone, the kind that meant his pressure had stopped its slide and was holding somewhere survivable, for now. Nobody in the room said anything about it, because saying it out loud felt like daring the moment to reverse itself. Somewhere in the middle of the next stitch, her fingers brushed a particular fold of tissue at a particular angle, and for half a second, the tent disappeared entirely. She was back under a bare bulb that flickered twice during the worst of it, back with a 19-year-old private who would not stop talking about his father's farm even as his voice grew thinner, back with hands that had finally, after 2 impossible procedures that week, started to shake. The memory lasted less than a second. It felt like longer. Her hands hesitated, just barely, just enough that Nora's eyes flicked up to check on her. Bree did not explain it. She did not have the time, and she would not have known how to put it into words even if she had. She let the old, familiar anger rise up instead, the kind she had learned to reach for whenever grief threatened to slow her down, a steadying thing rather than a wild one, and she pushed the needle through the next stitch with hands that had already stopped trembling by the time anyone else noticed. Bree kept working. Minutes passed in a way that did not feel like minutes at all, more like a single stretched breath that refused to end. She was aware, somewhere at the edge of her concentration, of voices outside the tent, of boots running back and forth, of the base reorganizing itself around the fact that its highest-ranking visitor was currently being operated on by a nurse nobody outside this room had ever heard of. None of that mattered while her hands were inside him. Out there was rank and politics and the kind of decisions that got written up in reports later. In here was only the wound, the clock, and the steady rhythm of her own pulse, which she kept low and even through nothing but stubbornness. "Pressure's climbing," Nora said quietly, eyes on the monitor. "Slowly, but it's climbing." Bree allowed herself one breath of relief before she went back to closing what needed closing, checking what needed checking, refusing to call this finished, until she was certain it actually was. Outside, the sound of an approaching helicopter began to grow, faint at first, then unmistakable. Major Lowry was inbound, 40 minutes finally running out, arriving to a patient who, against every reasonable expectation that had existed an hour earlier, was still breathing. Bree did not stop to feel anything about that yet. There would be time for feeling things later, in the drawer where she kept all of it, the kind of drawer that never seemed to run out of room. Right now there was still work to do, and work, she had learned a long time ago, was the only thing reliable enough to hold a person together when everything else threatened to come apart. The general's eyes had drifted shut sometime in the last several minutes, the anesthesia finally pulling him under fully, and for the first time since the blast, his face had lost the tight, suspicious set it had carried since the moment he first looked up and saw who was holding the scalpel. Whatever argument he still had left in him would have to wait until he woke up. For now, his body had simply agreed to live, with or without his permission. When Major Edward Lowry finally pushed through the tent flap 40 minutes later, breathless from the run across the base, he found a sight that made him stop in the doorway. A 4-star general lay stable on the table, vitals holding, incision closed with careful, practiced stitches. Standing over him, gloves stained dark red to the wrist, stood a young lieutenant he barely recognized by name, steady on her feet, despite everything that had clearly just happened in this tent. "Calloway," Lowry said slowly, looking at the monitor, then at her, then back at the monitor. "Talk me through what I'm looking at." Bree peeled off her gloves, finger by finger, and met his eyes without flinching. "You're looking at a man who's alive, because nobody else was in the room," she said. Lowry didn't answer right away. He moved to the table, checking the work with the careful eye of a man trained to find mistakes, running through the closure, the vitals, the dressing, searching for the kind of error that would explain away what he was seeing. He didn't find one. What he found instead was clean, competent work, the kind that did not belong to a person who had simply gotten lucky. Outside the tent, word was already spreading across the base faster than any official report could move. The general's convoy had been hit. The general had nearly died, and somehow, impossibly, a combat nurse with no surgical credentials on paper had been the one to save him, with her hands and nothing else, while everyone with the proper rank to stop her had either argued against it or stood back and let her work. Colonel Briggs stepped into the tent behind Lowry, his face unreadable, already turning over in his mind the conversation he knew was coming, the one with people far above his own rank, who would want to know exactly how a nurse had ended up performing emergency surgery on the most senior officer to visit this base in over a year. "He's stable?" Briggs asked. "He's stable," Lowry confirmed, still looking at Bree like he was trying to solve an equation that refused to balance. "I don't know how, but he's stable." Bree said nothing. She washed her hands at the small basin in the corner, watching the water run pink and then clear, feeling the adrenaline that had carried her through the last hour begin to drain out of her all at once, leaving behind the kind of exhaustion that settles into the bones rather than the muscles. She had done this before. She knew what came after the saving part, the questions, the disbelief, the very particular kind of trouble that follows a person who does the right thing the wrong way, in front of people who care more about the way than the right. Major Pratt was waiting just outside the tent, arms crossed, his expression caught somewhere between relief that the general had survived and frustration that survival had come from a source he could not control or explain. He watched Bree step out into the daylight, blinking against the sun, and he did not offer her the kind of look a person gives someone who has just saved a life. He offered her the kind of look reserved for someone who was about to cause him a great deal of paperwork. "This isn't over, Calloway," he said quietly, as she walked past him toward the small tent she shared with 2 other nurses, toward a cot she suddenly wanted more than anything she had wanted all day. "No," Bree agreed, not stopping. "It never is." Behind her, the helicopter that had carried Lowry in sat idle on the landing pad, rotors slowing, and somewhere inside the aid station, a 4-star general slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who did not yet know how close he had come to not waking up at all, or whose hands had made sure that he would. Sleep did not come easily that night, even though Bree's body had earned every hour of it. She lay on her cot staring at the canvas ceiling of her tent, listening to Ivy Sanderson's slow breathing on the cot beside her, and let her mind do the thing it had been refusing to do all day. It went backward, 18 months, to a place called Outpost Hollow Creek, a name that had sounded almost peaceful, until the day everything there stopped being peaceful at all. Hollow Creek had been small, isolated, and supplied with far less than it needed. When the road connecting it to the nearest base washed out during a stretch of heavy rain, the outpost had been cut off for 6 days, with no surgeon, no resupply, and a rotating list of injuries that grew worse every single day. Bree had been 24 then, newer, less certain of her own hands, but certain enough of one thing: a soldier bleeding in front of her was not going to die from her hesitation. She remembered the morning the bridge gave out, the radio operator's voice crackling through the small command tent, with the news that the only road connecting Hollow Creek to the nearest base had collapsed under 3 days of relentless rain, swallowed by a swollen river that had not been considered a serious risk by anyone's planning maps. Resupply convoys could not cross. Medevac helicopters were grounded by the same storm system that had caused the flooding in the first place. The outpost, 22 soldiers strong, had simply been cut off, with whatever medical supplies happened to be on hand, and nothing more coming for at least a week. The senior medic at Hollow Creek had been a steady, capable man named Sergeant Curtis Adler, and it was Adler who had first turned to Bree on the second day, after the first casualty came in, a private named Eli Donovan who had taken a hard fall during a perimeter check that had ended with a fractured rib, driven dangerously close to his lung. "I've stabilized what I can," Adler had told her, voice low, eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had already accepted the limits of his own training. "But this needs more than stabilizing. He needs someone to go in and fix it properly, and there isn't anyone here who's done that before." Bree remembered staring down at Donovan's pale, sweat-soaked face, remembered the careful rise and fall of his breathing that was growing shallower by the hour, and remembered making a decision in the space of about 4 seconds that would quietly define the rest of her career. She had assisted in surgical procedures before, had watched closely enough during her training rotations to understand the geography of what needed to happen, had a memory sharp enough to recall details most people let slip past them. It was not the same as being a surgeon. It would have to be enough anyway. "Get me everything sterile you can find," she had said, "and get ready to hand me whatever I ask for, the moment I ask for it." Adler had looked at her for a long moment, weighing the same impossible math she was weighing, and then nodded once, already moving to gather what supplies the outpost had on hand. The procedure had taken nearly 3 hours, performed under a single bare bulb that flickered twice during the most delicate portion of the work, with nothing but borrowed instruments and a steadiness she had not known she possessed until she needed it. Donovan had lived. He had thanked her 3 days later, in a voice still thin with recovery, and she had told him simply to thank the rain for stopping in time, because she had not yet learned how to accept gratitude for something that still felt, to her, like nothing more than necessity. The second man, 2 days later, had been worse, a corporal with internal bleeding from a fall during a supply run gone wrong, and she had lived through that one too, somehow, hands steadier than her heart had any right to be. The third had been a young private named Owen Hart, 19 years old, from a small town he talked about constantly in the hours before his injury, a boy who wanted nothing more than to go home and work on his father's farm. Owen had taken a piece of shrapnel low in the chest, in a place that even a fully equipped hospital would have struggled to fix in time. Bree had tried anyway. She had worked over him for nearly 2 hours, with hands that finally, for the first time in that long week, would not stop shaking. He had not made it. She remembered the exact moment his pulse had stopped responding to anything she did, the exact angle of the bare bulb swinging slightly overhead, the exact silence that had followed, broken only by her own breathing. She had not cried in front of anyone. She had cleaned her hands, covered him with care, and gone back to work on the next soldier who needed her, because that was the only thing that had ever made any of it bearable. Nobody had written up what happened at Hollow Creek. There had been no surgeon present to verify or question it, no formal record beyond the casualty report that simply noted 3 soldiers survived and 1 did not, with no mention of who had operated or how. The silence around it had felt, at the time, like mercy. Now, lying in her cot with a 4-star general's blood still under her fingernails no matter how many times she had scrubbed, that silence felt like something else entirely. It felt like a debt that had finally come due. She thought of Owen Hart's voice, the way he had talked about his father's farm right up until he stopped being able to talk at all, and she let herself feel it, just for a moment, in the dark where nobody could see. Then she closed the drawer again, the way she always did, and let exhaustion finally pull her under. Morning arrived with a knock that was not gentle. Colonel Briggs stood outside her tent, his face carrying the particular weariness of a man who had spent half the night on the radio explaining an incident that did not fit cleanly into any report he had ever filed before. "Calloway, you're wanted at headquarters. Is the general all right? He's stable, resting. That's not why they want you." Bree already knew, somehow, before Briggs said another word, that the quiet she had carried away from Hollow Creek was about to end. A formal inquiry had been opened, not because anyone doubted that the general was alive, but because nobody could agree on what to do with the fact that he was alive, thanks to a nurse who had, by every written rule, no business performing surgery at all. Word had reached the regional command structure faster than anyone on base had expected, and with it came a name Bree had never heard before but would come to know very well over the following days. Colonel Vivian Marsh, head of the Regional Medical Review Board, already inbound to investigate exactly what had happened in that aid station and why. Major Pratt met them at headquarters, looking like a man who had finally found solid ground to stand on after a day of feeling like the world had tilted sideways beneath him. The board wants statements from everyone present, he said. Calloway, Whitfield, Sanderson, Briggs, Lowry, when he's available, and the general himself once he's fit to speak. And until then? Briggs asked. Until then, Lieutenant Calloway is restricted to base, pending review. Bree absorbed that without much visible reaction, though something cold settled in her stomach at the words. Restricted to base, as if she had done something wrong instead of something necessary, as if the man breathing comfortably in the recovery tent down the hall was not living proof of exactly what her hands were capable of when the alternative was watching someone die. I understand, she said, because there was nothing else useful to say. She spent the next 2 days in a strange holding pattern, performing her ordinary duties, checking on patients, restocking supplies, while the base around her hummed with rumor and speculation. Some of it was kind. Some soldiers stopped her in passing to thank her, quietly, for what she had done. Others kept their distance, uncertain how to treat someone who had broken a rule in order to save a life, unsure whether that made her a hero or simply someone who had gotten away with something this time. On the first of those 2 days, the holding pattern broke apart for an entirely different reason. A young private named Caleb Whitmore was carried into the aid station just before noon, having taken a bad fall during an equipment drill that had ended with his leg pinned beneath a supply crate twice his weight. The injury was not life-threatening in the way the general's had been, but it was serious enough, a deep laceration with significant blood loss and the early signs of compartment syndrome setting in around the swelling muscle, the kind of injury that could cost a young soldier his leg if it was not addressed with speed and precision. Major Lowry was still off base on another transport run, and for a moment, the aid station fell into the same uneasy stillness it had carried 3 days earlier, everyone present silently calculating who would step forward this time. Bree did not hesitate the way she once might have. She had spent 18 months learning not to wait for permission that was not coming, and she was not about to relearn the habit of hesitation now, restricted to base or not. Get him on the table, she said, already moving. Ivy, I need that swelling assessed before we lose the window. The procedure was smaller in scale than what she had done for the general, but no less demanding, requiring a careful release of pressure around the muscle to prevent permanent damage, performed with the same steady focus she brought to everything that mattered. Whitmore, 19 years old himself, kept his eyes fixed on the canvas ceiling throughout, jaw clenched against the pain, asking her at one point, through gritted teeth, whether he was going to lose the leg. Not today, Bree told him, working steadily. Not on my table. He believed her, the way frightened soldiers often believe the person with their hands inside an open wound, because there was nothing else to do but believe her. 40 minutes later, the swelling had eased, the bleeding controlled, the leg saved from a fate that had seemed entirely possible an hour earlier. Whitmore would walk out of this outpost on his own 2 feet, and Bree allowed herself a small, private moment of satisfaction at that fact, before the weight of everything else waiting for her settled back onto her shoulders. Colonel Briggs had watched the entire procedure from the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in a way that worried her slightly, given that she was technically still restricted pending review and had just performed another unauthorized procedure in plain sight of half the base. That's going in the report too, he said afterward, not unkindly. I know, Bree said. I wasn't going to let him lose a leg because of timing. Briggs studied her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she could not quite read. No, he said finally. I don't suppose you were. He left it there, offering nothing further, but something in the set of his shoulders as he walked away suggested the report he intended to file would carry more nuance than the strict letter of the regulation might otherwise allow. Captain Nora Whitfield found her on the second evening, sitting alone outside the supply tent, watching the sun drop low over the perimeter fence. You did the right thing, Nora said, sitting down beside her without being asked. I know that, Bree said, Knowing it and having it matter to a review board are two different things. Marsh isn't unreasonable. I've worked with her before. Pratt isn't unreasonable either, technically. That's what makes it worse. He's not wrong about the regulations. He's just wrong about what matters more. Nora was quiet for a moment, watching the same sunset Bree was watching. Hollow Creek, she said finally, not as a question. Bree's jaw tightened slightly. You knew. I suspected. I didn't ask, because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready, and because some weeks, it's better not to know exactly how a person survived something. I just know you came back different. Steadier in some ways, quieter in others. 3 men lived because of those 6 days, Bree said. 1 didn't. And now Marsh is going to want to know about all 4 of them, not just the one in the recovery tent. Bree looked at her hands, the same hands that had pressed against the general's wound 2 days earlier. The same hands that had failed to save a 19-year-old who had wanted nothing more than to go home and work on his father's farm. She did not know, sitting there in the fading light, whether the review board would see those hands as the reason the general was alive, or simply as the reason an investigation now existed at all. Whatever they decide, she said quietly, I'd do it again, all of it, even the part where I lost him. Nora reached over and squeezed her shoulder once, briefly, the kind of gesture that said more than any speech could have. Then she stood, brushing dust from her uniform, and looked down at the younger woman with something close to pride. Then you'd better be ready to say that out loud, Nora said, because tomorrow they're going to ask you to. General Ashworth woke fully on the 3rd day, pulled up out of sedation slowly, the way a diver rises from deep water to avoid the bends. The first thing he registered was the dull ache low in his abdomen. The second thing he registered was the face of the young nurse adjusting his IV line, the same face that had been the last thing he remembered before the lights went out in that aid station. You, he said, voice rough from disuse. Lieutenant Calloway, sir, Bree said, not looking up from the IV line. Good to see you awake. You operated on me. I did. He shifted slightly against the pillows, testing the limits of his own pain, and studied her with the same suspicion he had carried into the surgery itself, though something in it had softened at the edges, whether he wanted it to or not. I told them I wanted a real surgeon. You did, Bree agreed. There wasn't one available in the time you had left. And you decided you'd do instead. I decided dying wasn't an acceptable alternative, sir. If that offends you, I understand. I'd ask that you save the complaint until after you've finished healing from it. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft mechanical rhythm of the monitor at his bedside. Ashworth was not a man accustomed to being spoken to that way, and for a moment Bree wondered if she had pushed further than was wise, given that her career currently hung on the goodwill of people exactly like him. But something in his expression shifted, a flicker of something that was not quite amusement and not quite respect, but adjacent to both. They tell me there's an inquiry, he said. There is. Are you frightened of it? Bree considered the question honestly before answering, because she suspected he would know if she lied. I'm frightened of what it might decide. I'm not frightened of what I did to put it in motion. Ashworth studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that had probably unsettled enough soldiers over 30 years of service to fill several outposts. That's a fine distinction. It's the only one that's ever mattered to me, sir. Tell me something, he said, his voice quieter now, the edge of command stripped away by exhaustion. In the moment, when you picked up that scalpel, did you think about what it might cost you, if it went wrong? Bree considered the question carefully before answering. I thought about it for about half a second, sir. Then I thought about the fact that you'd be dead either way if I let that half second turn into a full one. He almost smiled at that, the closest his battered face had come to anything resembling humor since waking. 30 years of command, and I've never once had a subordinate explain a decision to me in quite those terms. With respect, sir, most of your subordinates probably aren't used to explaining decisions to a man who was unconscious for the part that mattered. That earned an actual exhale of laughter, brief and pained, quickly swallowed by the discomfort of his healing wound. Careful, Lieutenant, I'm still your superior officer. Yes, sir, Bree said, allowing herself the smallest trace of a smile. I'll try to remember that, once you're well enough to enforce it. He let that sit, looking past her toward the canvas ceiling of the recovery tent, his mind clearly working through something he was not yet ready to say aloud. Bree finished adjusting the IV and stepped back, preparing to leave him to rest, when his voice stopped her at the tent flap. Lieutenant. She turned. The driver, Doyle. His voice had lost some of its edge. "He didn't make it." "No, sir." "He didn't." Ashworth closed his eyes briefly. The weight of that landing somewhere Bree recognized, a place every soldier who survived something carried whether they wanted to or not. "I'll want to know about him. Later, when I can do something useful with the information." "I'll make sure you get it, sir." She left him there, alone with the particular grief of a man who outranked nearly everyone he would ever meet, and still could not outrank the fact that someone had died bringing him here alive. It was not gratitude exactly, what had passed between them. It was something quieter and more complicated, the beginning of a debt neither of them yet knew how to settle. The complication arrived 2 nights later, without warning, the way complications always seem to. Bree was off duty, lying in her cot trying to find sleep that kept slipping away from her, when Ivy burst into the tent, breathless. "It's the general. Something's wrong." Bree was on her feet and moving before Ivy finished the sentence. The aid station, when she reached it, was already a controlled scramble. Nora at the general's bedside, his monitor throwing out readings that made the back of Bree's neck go cold. Fever spiking, heart rate climbing, the unmistakable signs of infection taking hold somewhere inside the surgical site, the kind of complication that could undo everything in a matter of hours if it went unanswered. "Lowry's off base," Nora said, voice tight. "Emergency transport. A casualty came in an hour ago. He's been in there ever since." "How long?" "At least another hour before he can even look at this." Bree's mind ran the same calculation it had run 3 nights earlier, except this time, the stakes carried an added weight. Colonel Vivian Marsh had arrived on base that very afternoon to begin the formal inquiry, and was, at this exact moment, asleep in the visiting officers' quarters, less than 200 yards from the tent where Bree now stood deciding, again, whether to act without permission. "Get her up," Bree said. "Marsh?" Ivy's eyes went wide. "You want the investigator here while you're operating again?" "I want a witness who outranks Pratt watching me do my job, instead of hearing about it secondhand," Bree said, already pulling on gloves. "Go." Nora was already laying out instruments, her movements quick and economical, the practiced rhythm of 2 people who had worked together long enough to anticipate each other's needs without speaking. "His temperature's climbed 2 full degrees in the last 20 minutes, she said. "If this is sepsis setting in, we don't have the hour Lowry needs." "It's not sepsis yet," Bree said, examining the surgical site with careful, searching fingers. "Not yet, but it's heading there fast if we don't get ahead of it right now." She could feel the heat radiating from the inflamed tissue beneath her hands, could see the telltale redness spreading slightly wider than it should have been at this stage of healing. Whatever had taken hold inside him was moving quickly, and quickly was the one speed she could not afford to match with caution. What followed was not the same surgery as before, not exactly. The wound itself was smaller, the danger more subtle, an infection working its way through tissue that had been healing well until it suddenly was not. But the pressure in the room was, if anything, sharper than it had been the first time, because now there was an audience whose entire purpose for being on this base was to judge whether what Bree was about to do should ever be allowed to happen at all. Colonel Vivian Marsh arrived in under 5 minutes, hair still pulled back hastily, uniform thrown on over sleep clothes, and took up a position near the doorway where she could see everything without being in the way. She did not speak. She watched, sharp-eyed, missing nothing, as Bree worked through the infected site with the same calm, deliberate hands that had stopped a fatal bleed 3 nights earlier. "Talk me through what you're doing," Marsh said quietly, midway through, not as a challenge, but as something closer to genuine curiosity. "Draining the site, clearing necrotic tissue, getting ahead of the infection before it reaches his bloodstream," Bree said, not breaking concentration. "If we wait for Lowry, it has another hour to spread. I'm not willing to give it that hour." Marsh said nothing further, simply watched, her expression unreadable in the way that people who have spent careers evaluating others learn to keep their faces unreadable. Behind her, Major Pratt appeared in the doorway, alerted by the commotion, and went very still at the sight of Marsh standing there, witnessing exactly the kind of unauthorized procedure he had spent 3 days arguing should never have happened in the first place. Pratt opened his mouth to object. Marsh raised one hand, without looking at him, and he closed it again. The procedure took 40 minutes. By the end of it, the general's fever had begun to ease, his vitals settling back into a rhythm that no longer made the monitor scream its warnings. Bree stepped back from the table, exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical, and found Colonel Marsh's eyes already on her, studying her with an intensity that gave away nothing about what conclusions she had drawn. "That's the second time in 3 days," Marsh said. "Yes, ma'am. And the third time, 18 months ago, at a place called Hollow Creek. I understand." Bree's hands stilled for half a second before she finished removing her gloves. "Yes, ma'am. 3 lives saved there. 1 lost. Yes, ma'am." Marsh studied her a moment longer, then looked past her to the general, sleeping more peacefully now than he had in hours, his fever already retreating under the work Bree's hands had just finished. When she spoke again, her voice carried none of the warmth of approval, but none of the coldness of condemnation either. It carried something far more useful, the careful, measuring tone of a person who had just watched evidence arrive that would shape every decision she made for the rest of this inquiry. "Get some rest, Lieutenant," Marsh said. "You and I have a great deal to discuss tomorrow." That discussion came the following morning, before the formal hearing convened, in the quiet of a small briefing room, rather than the crowded tent where testimony would later be given. Marsh sat across a narrow table from her, no notepad in front of her this time, no officers flanking either side, just 2 women and a pot of coffee neither of them had touched. "I want to ask you something off the record," Marsh said. "Not as the head of this review board, as someone who spent 6 years as a trauma surgeon before I ever wore this rank." Bree straightened slightly, surprised. "I didn't know that, ma'am. Most people don't ask. It's not in the introduction anyone gives me anymore." Marsh studied her for a long moment. "I want to know what it felt like, the second time, knowing I was standing in the doorway. Most people freeze under observation. You didn't so much as glance my way until it was over." Bree considered the question honestly. "I've thought about that a lot since the hearing was announced, ma'am. I think the truth is, by the time you arrived, the only thing that mattered to me was the wound in front of me. Everything else, including whether you'd end my career for what I was doing, became background noise. I'm not sure if that makes me reckless or simply built the way the job requires." Marsh allowed a small, rare smile, the first Bree had seen from her since she'd arrived on base. "In my experience, Lieutenant, those are not always different things. The best surgeons I ever trained had exactly that same blindness to consequence in the moment, and exactly that same reckoning with it afterward. It's a difficult quality to teach. Most people either have it or they don't." "And which is it, ma'am, in your judgment?" "That," Marsh said, rising from the table and gathering the folder she had carried in untouched, "is precisely what tomorrow's proceedings are for. But between the 2 of us, off the record, I think you already know my answer." She left it there, offering nothing further, and Bree walked out of that small room carrying a steadiness she had not expected to find before facing the full weight of the formal hearing ahead. The hearing convened the following afternoon in the largest tent on base, the one normally reserved for briefings and rare visiting dignitaries, now arranged with a long folding table at the front, where Colonel Vivian Marsh sat flanked by 2 other officers from the regional command, brought in to ensure the review carried proper weight. Rows of chairs faced them, occupied by the people whose statements would decide what happened next to Bree Calloway's career, and possibly her freedom. Bree sat near the front, uniform pressed, hands folded in her lap to keep them from betraying how tightly her nerves were wound. Beside her sat Nora Whitfield, present to give testimony, and a few rows back sat Ivy Sanderson, Sergeant Combs, and Major Lowry, all called to account for what they had witnessed over the past 5 days. Colonel Briggs sat near the front as well, his face set in the careful neutrality of a commander who knew this hearing reflected on his own judgment as much as anyone else's. Major Pratt sat across the aisle, posture rigid, a folder of notes in front of him that he had clearly spent the previous night preparing with the same thoroughness he brought to everything that worried him. Marsh opened the proceedings without ceremony. "We are here to review the actions of First Lieutenant Bree Calloway on the date of the convoy incident, and on a subsequent date involving post-operative complications, in light of established protocols regarding qualified surgical personnel. We will also be reviewing prior incidents at Outpost Hollow Creek, as they bear directly on this lieutenant's demonstrated capabilities and the precedent any decision here may set." The first to speak was Major Pratt, and he did not waste the opportunity. He laid out, methodically, every regulation Bree had technically violated, every chain of command she had bypassed, every risk she had taken with the life of the most senior officer to visit this base in over a year. He was not cruel about it, and he was not wrong about the facts, which made his case all the more difficult to sit through. "This is not a question of outcome," Pratt said, near the end of his statement. The general lived. We are grateful for that. But if we excuse a clear violation of protocol simply because it worked, we are telling every nurse, every medic, every soldier with basic training and a steady hand that they are free to act as a surgeon whenever they judge the moment serious enough. That is not a precedent this command can responsibly set. Marsh let the statement settle before turning to Bree. Lieutenant, your response. Bree stood, smoothing her uniform once, and found that her voice, when it came, was steadier than she expected. Major Pratt is right about the regulations. I broke them. I would break them again under the same circumstances, and I want that on the record clearly, because I think it matters more than anything else I could say here. A few of the officers exchanged glances at that, the bluntness of it landing harder than a more careful answer might have. The general had perhaps 20 minutes, Bree continued. Major Lowry was 40 out. I am not a surgeon by training, but I have, twice now, been the only qualified set of hands available in a situation where the alternative to acting was watching someone die in front of me. I did not act because I believed myself superior to the rules. I acted because the rules did not account for the specific math of that moment, and I was not willing to let a man die so that the math could stay clean. And Hollow Creek? Marsh asked. Bree's jaw tightened slightly, but she did not look away. 6 days, no surgeon, 3 patients. I saved 2 of them outright. The third, Private Owen Hart, did not survive his injuries despite everything I tried. I have never reported what happened there, because there was no official record requiring it, and because, frankly, I did not know how to explain it to anyone who had not been standing in that room with me. The tent went quiet at that, the kind of quiet that carries weight rather than emptiness. Why tell us now? One of the other officers asked. Because Colonel Marsh already knew, and because I would rather be judged honestly for everything I've done than partially for some of it, Bree said. If this board decides what happened at Hollow Creek and what happened with General Ashworth disqualifies me from continued service, I will accept that decision. But I will not pretend I regret either choice. 2 men are alive at Hollow Creek because I did not wait for permission that wasn't coming. A 4-star general is alive in the recovery tent right now for the same reason. The second of the 2 visiting officers, a sharp-eyed man named Colonel Whitman who had said little until that point, leaned forward, studying Bree with the careful attention of someone searching for the crack in an otherwise solid argument. Lieutenant, let me put this plainly. If we set the precedent that any nurse may act as a surgeon whenever they judge the moment serious enough, what stops the next person from making that same judgment wrongly? What stops someone less capable than you from killing a patient they had no business operating on, simply because they believed, in the moment, that they were you? Bree did not answer immediately, weighing the question with the same care she had weighed every decision since the convoy attack. Nothing stops them, sir, except training, honesty, and the willingness to be judged afterward, the way I am being judged right now. I'm not asking this board to declare that anyone with steady hands should reach for a scalpel whenever they feel brave enough. I'm asking it to recognize that there are moments when the alternative to acting is certain death, and that those moments deserve a framework instead of silence. Right now, there is no framework. There is only people like me, making the choice alone, in the dark, and hoping afterward that what they did was right. Whitman held her gaze a moment longer, then sat back slightly, something in his posture suggesting the answer had landed closer to what he needed than he had expected. That is, at least, an honest answer, he said, and made a brief note on the paper in front of him. Nora Whitfield testified next, describing in careful clinical detail the speed and competence of Bree's work, the deterioration that would have certainly occurred without intervention, the absence of any viable alternative in either case. Ivy Sanderson, nervous but resolute, confirmed every detail. Sergeant Combs spoke briefly about the chaos of the convoy attack and the speed with which Bree had moved toward danger rather than away from it. Major Lowry, called last among the staff, examined both procedures on record and confirmed, with visible reluctance to admit it changed nothing about the regulatory violation, that the work itself had been performed to a standard he would expect from a fully trained surgeon under field conditions. I want to be clear, Lowry said, addressing the board directly. What she did was against regulation. I also want to be clear that if she had waited for me, in either case, the patient very likely dies. Those 2 facts exist at the same time, and I don't envy this board having to weigh them against each other. The final testimony came from an unexpected source. General Ashworth himself, still recovering, still moving with careful effort, requested permission to address the board, and Marsh granted it without hesitation, recognizing that whatever this man had to say would carry weight no one else in the room could match. He was helped to a chair near the front, and he sat for a long moment before speaking, gathering whatever it was he intended to say. "I told her, while she was working to save my life, that she was not a surgeon," he began. "I said it like an accusation. I want this board to understand that I said it because I was afraid, and because 30 years of rank had taught me to measure competence by credentials rather than results. I was wrong to say it the way I did. I have had several days lying in that recovery tent to think about exactly how wrong." He paused, looking directly at Bree for the first time since the hearing began. "I do not know what this board's regulations require of you. I know what I require of myself, which is to say plainly, in front of everyone here, that I am alive because Lieutenant Calloway made a decision I would not have had the courage to make in her position, and made it correctly, twice, under conditions that would have broken steadier hands than mine. Whatever this board decides about regulations and precedent, I would ask that it weigh the cost of losing officers like her against the cost of occasionally allowing them to act outside the lines when the alternative is watching soldiers die for the sake of those lines." The tent was silent when he finished. Marsh thanked him quietly, and he was helped back to his feet, pausing beside Bree's chair on his way out, resting a hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture that said more than the testimony itself had. Marsh closed the proceedings for the day, informing the room that the board would deliberate and return with a decision within 48 hours. Bree walked out of the tent into the late afternoon light feeling emptied out in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery and everything to do with finally saying out loud, in front of strangers with the power to end her career, the full truth about Hollow Creek and Owen Hart, a truth she had carried alone for 18 months. Nora fell into step beside her, saying nothing for a while, simply walking, letting the silence do what words could not. "You held nothing back in there," Nora said eventually. "I was tired of holding it," Bree said. "Whatever they decide, at least it's an honest decision now, not one built on half the story." "For what it's worth," Nora said, "I think you just made it very hard for that board to take anything away from you." Bree did not answer that. She had learned a long time ago not to predict outcomes she could not control, and the next 48 hours felt like the longest stretch of waiting she had endured since 6 days at Hollow Creek, with no surgeon and a row of cots that kept filling faster than she could empty them. The 48 hours passed slowly, the way time always seems to slow down, exactly when a person most wants it to move. Bree kept working through her ordinary duties because standing still felt worse than staying busy, but her mind kept circling back to the hearing tent, replaying her own words, wondering if honesty had been the right choice, or simply the only one she had been capable of making by that point. On the second evening, with the verdict still pending, she sat alone at a small table outside the supply tent with a pad of paper in front of her, finally writing something she had put off for 18 months, a letter to the Hart family, the parents of a 19-year-old private who had talked endlessly about his father's farm in the final days of his life. She had never written to them, partly because there had been no official channel requiring it, and partly because she had not known how to explain her role in his final hours without explaining things she was not supposed to admit to. That excuse no longer applied. The truth was already sitting in front of a review board, waiting to be judged. She wrote slowly, choosing each word with more care than she had given almost anything else in her life. She told them about the farm, about how often he had spoken of it, about the particular way his voice had lifted whenever he described the way morning light fell across the fields in autumn. She told them, gently, that she had been with him at the end, that he had not been afraid, that he had spent his final conscious hours talking about home rather than about what was happening to him. She did not pretend the outcome had been anything other than what it was. She simply made sure they knew that someone had been there, that he had not been alone, and that the people around him had done everything within their power and skill to bring him home. She folded the letter carefully, addressed it, and sat with it in her hands for a long moment, before finally setting it aside to be sent in the morning. Something in her chest loosened slightly as she did, not relief exactly, but the particular release that comes from finally setting down a weight that has been carried silently for too long. The verdict arrived the next afternoon, delivered in the same briefing tent where the hearing had taken place, though this time the mood in the room felt different, charged with an anticipation that had nothing to do with dread, and everything to do with simply wanting the waiting to end. Colonel Marsh stood to deliver the board's findings, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had spent 2 full days weighing testimony against regulation, outcome against precedent, courage against the dangers of excusing it too easily. This board finds that Lieutenant Calloway's actions on each occasion in question constituted a clear departure from established protocol regarding the performance of surgical procedures by personnel without formal surgical credentials, Marsh began, and Bree felt her stomach drop at the opening, bracing for what she assumed would follow. However, the word hung in the air, and Marsh let it hang there a moment before continuing. This board also finds that in each instance, the departure from protocol was the direct and necessary cause of a patient's survival, under conditions in which no qualified surgical alternative existed within a survivable window of time. This board does not find that Lieutenant Calloway acted recklessly, nor that she acted outside the bounds of reasonable judgment given the information available to her in each moment. This board further finds that the existing protocols, as written, contain no adequate provision for situations of this nature, and recommends, in the strongest possible terms, the creation of a formal field surgical authorization designation, to be granted to qualified medical personnel, under conditions to be defined by this and future reviews. A quiet ripple moved through the room at that, the sound of people exhaling all at once. As for Lieutenant Calloway's standing, Marsh continued, this board recommends no disciplinary action. This board further recommends that her record be formally amended to reflect her demonstrated surgical competence under field conditions, and that consideration be given to advanced surgical training, at her discretion, in recognition of skills this command would be foolish to leave undeveloped. Bree sat very still, processing the words slowly, as if they might dissolve if she moved too quickly. Beside her, Nora reached over and gripped her hand once, hard, before letting go. A few rows back, she heard Ivy let out a breath that was almost a laugh, the sound of someone who had been holding tension in her chest for 2 full days finally allowed to release it. Major Pratt, across the aisle, did not look pleased exactly, but he did not look angry either. He looked, instead, like a man recalculating, the way careful people recalculate when new information arrives that does not fit the model they had been working from. He caught Bree's eye briefly as the room began to break apart into quiet conversation, and gave her a single short nod, not quite an apology, but something adjacent to respect. For what it's worth, he said, approaching her afterward, I still believe the regulations exist for good reasons. I'm glad, this time, that you were better than the reasons I had for stopping you. It was not a warm statement. Bree did not need it to be. She accepted it for what it was, an honest concession from a man who had never pretended to be anything other than careful, and found that she respected him more for refusing to suddenly become her biggest supporter than she would have if he had. Colonel Briggs found her shortly afterward, standing near the entrance of the tent, watching the rest of the room slowly empty out into the late afternoon light. You had me worried there, Calloway, he said. Not about whether you'd done the right thing, about whether the rest of the world would be able to see it the way the rest of us did. I worried about that too, sir, Bree admitted. For what it's worth, I'd already decided, before any of this, that I'd rather command a base full of people who act when it matters than people who wait for permission while soldiers bleed out in front of them. This board just made it official. He extended a hand and she shook it, grateful for the steadiness of it after 2 days of uncertainty. Take the rest of the day. You've earned it. Major Lowry caught her on the way out as well, his usual clinical reserve softened by something closer to genuine warmth. I owe you an apology, he said. Not for the regulations. Those exist for good reason, most days. But for the way I looked at you in that tent, the first time, like you'd done something wrong instead of something extraordinary, I won't make that mistake again. You don't owe me anything, sir, Bree said. You showed up and confirmed the work was sound. That mattered more than you probably realize. Before she left the briefing tent that evening, Bree stopped at the small wooden marker the base had erected near the chapel for Corporal Sam Doyle, the driver who had not survived the initial blast, and whose name had been spoken only in passing throughout 2 days of testimony about the man he had been carrying. She stood there a long moment in the fading light, thinking of how quickly the world had moved past his death toward the more dramatic story of the general's survival, and made herself a quiet promise that she would not let his name be forgotten, simply because the headlines, official or otherwise, had settled elsewhere. You got him here alive, she said softly, to no one but the marker and the darkening sky. That's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. General Ashworth remained on base another 10 days, while his recovery progressed enough to permit travel, and in that time, something between him and Bree settled into a quiet, unspoken arrangement that neither of them named out loud. She checked on him each morning during her rounds. He asked her questions he would not have asked a week earlier, about her training, about Hollow Creek, about what had drawn her to combat nursing in the first place, rather than a safer post somewhere far from convoys and shrapnel. "My older brother served," she told him one morning, adjusting his chart at the foot of the bed. "He came home with injuries nobody fixed quickly enough, because the right people weren't in the right place at the right time. I decided I'd rather be the right person in the wrong place than the wrong person standing around waiting for someone else to show up." Ashworth absorbed that quietly, turning it over the way he seemed to turn over most things now, with a deliberateness that had not been there in the man who had once demanded a real surgeon from his hospital bed. "And Owen Hart," he said, "did you ever send that letter?" "I did." "His family, have you heard back?" "Not yet. It's only been a few days." He nodded slowly, and something in his expression suggested he was filing this information away for a purpose he had not yet revealed. Bree did not press him on it. She had learned, over the past 2 weeks, that General Ashworth was a man who preferred to act rather than explain, and she suspected whatever he was planning would announce itself in its own time. It announced itself 5 days later, in the form of a letter delivered to Bree through official channels, carrying the seal of a military hospital several states from the small farming town the Hart family called home. Attached to it was a brief note, handwritten, from General Ashworth himself, explaining that he had taken the liberty of ensuring Private Owen Hart's family received not only her letter, but a formal commendation for their son's conduct in his final hours, along with a personal visit from a regional commander who had, until recently, known nothing about Hollow Creek at all. The letter from the family, when Bree finally worked up the courage to read it fully, was not what she expected. There was grief in it, naturally, grief that had not faded in 18 months and likely never fully would. But there was something else too, a kind of gratitude she had not anticipated, a relief at finally knowing the specific details of their son's final hours instead of the vague, bureaucratic language of a standard casualty notification. They thanked her for staying with him. They thanked her for trying. They told her, in words that nearly undid the careful composure she had maintained through the entire hearing, that knowing he had spoken of home until the very end meant more to them than any medal ever could. She read the letter 3 times before folding it away into the small box where she kept the few things that mattered enough to carry from posting to posting. Something in her chest, that had been clenched tight for 18 months finally, quietly, began to loosen. Ashworth's gesture did not stop there. In the days before his departure, word filtered down through the base that he had personally recommended Corporal Sam Doyle, the driver who had not survived the initial blast, for a posthumous commendation of his own, recognizing the steady service that had carried the convoy safely for months, before the single moment none of them could have prevented. He visited Doyle's family himself, several weeks after returning home, sitting in their living room in his dress uniform and telling them, plainly and without the polished language of an official condolence letter, exactly how their son had died protecting the people in that convoy, and exactly how much that final act of service had meant to the man he had been carrying. He had also, quietly and without fanfare, ensured that Bree's amended record included not just acknowledgement of what happened with him, but a formal review and reclassification of everything she had done at Hollow Creek, finally closing the silence that had surrounded those 6 days for a year and a half. On the morning of his departure, Ashworth requested Bree's presence at the helicopter pad, where his transport waited, rotors beginning their slow warm-up cycle. He stood with more strength than he'd had in 2 weeks, leaning only slightly on a cane he would need for another month or so, and looked at her with an expression that had traveled a long way from the suspicion of their first meeting. "I owe you a debt I'm not sure how to repay," he said, voice raised slightly over the growing engine noise. "Men in my position aren't accustomed to owing debts to lieutenants. We're trained to believe rank settles most accounts." "You don't owe me anything, sir," Bree said. "I did my job." "You did considerably more than your job, and we both know it." He studied her for a moment, the cane shifting slightly under his weight. "I've recommended you for advanced surgical training, should you want it. Full credentials, proper instruction, the kind of program that would let you do, with full authority, exactly what you've already proven you can do without it." Bree felt something catch in her throat that she had not expected to feel. That's a generous offer, sir. It's not generosity. It's overdue recognition of a fact your record should have reflected a long time before I showed up bleeding in the back of a wrecked vehicle. He extended his hand, and she shook it, the grip firm despite his weakened condition. Whatever you decide, Lieutenant Calloway, you've earned the right to decide it on your own terms. That's the least I can offer in exchange for my life. She watched him board the helicopter, watched it lift off the pad and bank away toward the horizon, carrying the most powerful man she had ever treated, back toward a world of briefings and command structures and decisions that would shape outcomes far beyond this small, dusty base. She stood there long after the sound of the rotors had faded, feeling the particular stillness that follows the closing of something significant, even when what comes next remains uncertain. The weeks that followed settled into something closer to ordinary life, though ordinary now carried a different weight than it had before the convoy attack. Bree returned to her regular duties, restocking trauma kits, treating minor injuries, training newer medics in techniques she had once learned through nothing but necessity, and a folding table under a bare bulb. Soldiers who passed her in the corridors of the aid station nodded to her differently now, not with the wary distance of people unsure what to make of a rule breaker, but with the quiet respect reserved for people whose competence had been tested under the worst possible conditions and found, every time, to be enough. Private Caleb Whitmore stopped by the aid station one afternoon, on his way back from a light-duty assignment, walking with only the faintest trace of a limp on the leg she had saved months earlier. He lingered near the doorway a moment, awkward in the way young soldiers often were around the people who had once held their lives in careful hands. "Just wanted you to see it still works," he said, gesturing down at his leg with a half-smile. Bree looked him over, genuinely pleased at the sight of him moving so well. "Looks like it's holding up better than most things around here. Doctors back home say I should have lost it, said the swelling alone should have done permanent damage." He shrugged, suddenly a little shy. "Figured you'd want to know that didn't happen, on account of you." "I appreciate you telling me," Bree said, and meant it more than the simple words let on. There was something quietly sustaining about watching the results of her work walk through a doorway on two working legs, a reminder, on the harder days, of exactly why all of it had been worth the risk. He left with a final nod, and Bree returned to her work with the particular lightness that came from such small, unannounced confirmations that the choices she had made, again and again, had mattered to someone beyond the walls of a review board's tent. Major Pratt remained careful around her, true to his nature, but the careful had shifted into something closer to professional trust than suspicion. He stopped by the aid station one afternoon, several weeks after the hearing, to drop off a stack of updated protocol documents reflecting the new field surgical authorization the review board had recommended. Documents that, for the first time, included her name in the formal language defining how such authorizations would be granted in the future. "Figured you'd want to see this before it goes wider," he said, setting the folder on her desk. "You're listed as the founding case study, Hollow Creek and the convoy both." Bree flipped through the pages slowly, reading language that transformed two of the most isolating, secretive experiences of her career into something official, something that would help the next nurse or medic who found themselves standing over a dying soldier with no surgeon for 40 minutes, and a decision that could not wait. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "Don't thank me. I still think the regulations matter." Pratt paused at the tent flap, looking back at her with something that might have been the closest he ever came to warmth. "I just think now that they needed people like you to show us where they were wrong." She thought often, in those quiet weeks, about the offer Ashworth had made her on the helicopter pad, the promise of full surgical credentials and proper training, waiting for her at a hospital far from any convoy or outpost. Nora asked her about it one evening, the two of them sharing a quiet meal outside the supply tent, the kind of ordinary moment that had become more precious since the hearing. "Are you going to take it?" Nora asked. Bree considered the question for a long moment before answering, turning her fork slowly through food she had barely touched. "I used to think the credentials were the whole point, that if I just had the right paper behind my name, none of this would have been complicated. Now I'm not so sure the paper was ever the thing that mattered most." "That's not really an answer." "I know." Bree allowed herself a small, tired smile. "I think I'll take it, not because I need it to do the work, because the next time I'm standing over someone with no surgeon for 40 minutes, I'd rather have every tool available to me, not just the ones I taught myself out of necessity." Nora nodded slowly, satisfied with that, and the conversation drifted on to smaller things, the ordinary rhythms of a life that had finally found its footing again after weeks of standing on uncertain ground. The formal acceptance letter went out 2 days later, carrying Bree's signature beneath a program start date still many months away, a promise of a future she had once assumed was closed to someone like her, now opened simply because she had refused, twice, to let a person die waiting for permission. Months later, on an afternoon much like the one that had started everything, another convoy rolled toward the base, dust rising behind it in a long, familiar column. Bree watched it approach from the doorway of the aid station, feeling the old instinct rise in her chest, the readiness that never fully went away no matter how many quiet weeks passed in between. This time, the convoy arrived without incident, vehicles rolling smoothly through the gate, soldiers climbing out stretching tired limbs after a long patrol. Nothing more dramatic than the ordinary fatigue of a long day's travel. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding and turned back to her work, restocking trauma kits with the same careful attention she had been giving them on the morning everything changed. There were nights, still, when Owen Hart's voice found its way into the quiet before sleep, when she thought of the way he had talked about his father's farm right up until he no longer could, and on those nights, she let herself feel the weight of it fully, no longer needing to close it away in a drawer the way she once had. The board's recognition, the general's gratitude, the letter from a grieving family in a small farming town, none of it had erased what happened to him. It had simply given her somewhere honest to set that grief down, instead of carrying it alone in silence the way she had for a year and a half. Somewhere far from this dusty outpost, a 4-star general was recovering in comfort, carrying a story about the day he learned that the most important qualification a person could have was not always the one printed on their orders. Somewhere else, a family in a small farming town now slept slightly easier knowing their son had not been alone in his final hours, that he had spoken of home until the very end, and that his sacrifice had, in some small way, helped change the rules for every soldier who came after him. And here, in a place that asked more of its people than any training manual could fully prepare them for, a young combat nurse kept doing the work nobody had trained her to do, ready, as she always had been, to reach for whatever the moment required, scalpel or otherwise, the instant it was needed, and not 1 second later.